Excellent. As Aaron said, my background is not in a Gigabit. Over the last several years, I've been a researcher focused on the smart cities arena, and my PhD's in entrepreneurship, so pretty much everything I do looks at entrepreneurship, innovation in a city's context. I have a pretty active research stream in this space, so I'm going to tie in some of my research activity and some observations from what I'm seeing happening in cities around the world and how I think, I'm only loosely tying it back to gigabit cities, but I think a lot of you can make the connections pretty strongly. I will talk about a few use cases, but I think you're aware of quite a few of them as well. So I'm going to start by talking about innovation in the 20th century, and this is I guess how I was trained in my PhD program in terms of what entrepreneurship and innovation is about. And I'm going to sort of show how all of that is not true anymore. We're in a different world. So I heard earlier today the suggestion or the discussion about Silicon Valley. I think one or two of you are from that area. How many of you have been to Silicon Valley, like in the valley? How many of you would classify Silicon Valley as a dynamic, exciting, creative, urban, pedestrian-friendly, sustainable, smart city type atmosphere? Not so much. Very, very far away. So even today, when you hear this discussion about economic development and entrepreneurship and innovation, you still hear cities around the world saying, we're trying to replicate Silicon Valley. We're trying to be the Silicon Valley of fill in the blank. I think that's the wrong direction because it's not consistent with where the world is going. We used to, and we still do, hear a lot about venture capital. Venture capital is for a very small, minute portion of the startup community. And of course, a lot of people in the Valley will even tell you that there's an argument that maybe the venture capital model is broken. I won't go into details why, but assuming Silicon Valley, suburban tech park, venture capital funded startup community is what all your cities want is a wrong assumption. We used to think about patents, building technology, proprietary technology, closed innovation systems. We used to do a lot of tech push. How many of you have heard of the Iridium project from 1999? $6 billion or so spent on launching 62 or so satellites into orbit for one of the world's first truly mobile global cell phone services. Sounds kind of interesting if you put yourself back in 1999 as a potential customer. Forgetting that now it's totally ubiquitous and everybody has smartphones and all that. Until you dig in deeper, $3,000 to $5,000 to buy the thing, $5 a minute, weight about 5 pounds. Oh, by the way, there's one other small problem. It only works if you have direct line of sight to the satellite. So if you're in, I don't know, a car or a building or dense urban environments, it probably won't work. Kind of obvious now that wouldn't work, but they spent billions of dollars, Motorola, finding out it wouldn't work. Old way of thinking about innovation, technology, closed, tech push. 21st century innovation. Richard Florida, many of you know who he is. He's the visionary behind the creative class concept for cities. He's been studying over the past few years this interesting migration of venture capital into cities. And what he's finding is that, in fact, there's more investment from venture capital into firms founded in cities than into firms founded in rural or suburban tech park areas. So in the most classic example, there's been a migration of the big-time tech players in the Valley moving towards San Francisco, the city. Why? Kind of obvious. Where would you rather live and work if you're a millennial? In Silicon Valley or in San Francisco? That's basically a lot of the philosophy behind Richard Florida's thesis that he's been promoting over the past several years. So another thing, I mentioned venture capital sort of, I wouldn't say it's on the way out, but it's certainly no longer the be-all, end-all we used to think it was as entrepreneurs. Anybody ever seen this campaign? Coolest Cooler? Cool project. Guy was looking at a tinker, a maker, working out of his home basically. Prototype said, you know, there's got to be a need for, somebody's got to create a 21st century version of the cooler. Why do we keep using the same old basic low-tech solution for cooling beverages? So he created a version, put it on Kickstarter as a crowdfunding campaign, was trying to raise $100,000, didn't get there, the campaign failed, went back to the drawing board, learned from his lessons, tried to raise $50,000. If you're not familiar, this Kickstarter version that he was using is what's often called the rewards-based model, where you pre-sell your product before you've developed it, and you find out if people actually want it and how many people want it. So unless you get to your campaign goal, you don't get the project off the ground. So he started with $100,000 the first time, didn't make it. He said, okay, I'm going to improve the prototype, and I'm going to only try to raise $50,000 and just get the project started. A few months later, his goal was $50,000, and he raised slightly over that in $13 million. Guess what? How much of that was venture capital? Zero. How much equity did he give away for this money? Zero. Very interesting. This is not the only case like this. There are many like this. There's another famous one some of you might have heard of, is Oculus, which is a 3D viewing for video games. They were trying to raise something like $100,000. They raised $2.5 million. They eventually raised $70 million right after that from venture capital, and they sold for $2 billion about 2 years later to Facebook. Different model of innovation than we used to think about. And I think at the core, a lot of what I'm talking about is this idea of open innovation. This is Henry Chesborough from Berkeley. He's sort of the father of the open innovation concept. So thinking opposed to the idea of this closed innovation I was talking about, it's the opposite. It is, how do we engage the crowds in co-innovating, co-creating new things? And once you can figure out ways to harness the power of the crowd, it changes everything. You have these platform players that are intermediaries between companies or innovators and potential collaborators, citizens, potential consumers, who co-collaborate and co-create new ideas and new solutions and co-fund the best ideas. I don't know how many of you heard about this. This news came out just about 10 days ago. Toyota's trying to really give a big push now into fuel cell vehicles, and they realize they can't do this alone. In the new world, the open innovation world, they still have patents. In fact, they have over 5,000 patents associated just with fuel cell technology. But guess what they decided to do 10 days ago? Make them all publicly available, freely. No longer is this about closed proprietary innovation from massive corporations. It's more about this distributed, wide innovation that's happening through crowds. Some of you, probably many of you, have heard of the methodology called Lean Startup. So this idea around open innovation and being in touch with consumers and users early in the innovation process is not just a thing for corporation, but it's also how all startups are being taught these days. So when I got my PhD in 2001, and I had never started a company in my life, but my PhD was in entrepreneurship from University of Colorado. I had no idea what I was talking about when I was teaching entrepreneurship. And so I feel sorry for about 3 or 4 years worth of students that had to take my classes because I didn't know what I was doing, and I was teaching business planning. That's what everybody did back then. Now we don't teach business planning anymore in business schools, or at least barely do. We've moved on to Lean Startup, which is basically the idea of early testing of your ideas, getting onto the street as soon as possible, interacting with what's called an MVP, minimum viable product, with your potential users, and co-creating with them a better solution before you waste $5 billion and send 63 satellites into space. This guy I never actually met, but I lived in Vancouver for 11 years. This is a picture of him in his condo in Vancouver. he started this website. I'm not going to ask any of you if you actually know it, because it would be embarrassing if you did probably, but it's called Plenty of Fish. Plenty of Fish was one of the first free dating websites in the world. This story was written in 2009. The guy was early in learning how to do certain types of programming and interacted through meetups and things like that in the Vancouver tech scene. And he decided that he just wanted to create this website as like a test for his programming ability. And he was just trying to figure out how to test his ability. And he thought, I'll just create a dating site, make it free, and test some of his ideas he was thinking about and germinating with his collaborators in Vancouver. He started the site by himself. A few years later, this is 2009, the guy had 2 employees, was making $10 million in revenue a year. One of my big takeaways for you from this session is every time I go to events like this where there's a lot of municipalities involved and they're thinking about economic development, they're all still thinking old school, in my opinion. They're all still thinking about the old way. How do we attract the big companies or the tech companies, or how do we facilitate these high-tech, high-growth startups? I'm not saying that's bad. All economies would love to have some of them. But the new world of innovation is not necessarily about creating the next Google. There aren't going to be a lot of next Googles. But there'll be a lot of guys like this. And the last one I showed that made $13 million on his cooler idea. So what are the roles for cities in all this? So I mentioned Henry Chesbrough is the father of open innovation. I'm working on a research project where we've invited authors to propose or to present research projects related to this idea of how cities are becoming a platform for open innovation and entrepreneurship. And we have 15 articles that are going through the process. One of them is from Richard Florida, by the way, on this new data he has on the migration of venture capital into cities. Aaron asked me to talk about smart cities, so anytime I talk about smart cities, I have to show my wheel. This is a smart cities wheel I developed a few years ago. You can read much more about it in Fast Company, where I've published a bunch of articles about how to measure and benchmark and think about what a smart city is. I have a bunch of indicators behind this. Some of them include the percentage of homes and businesses that have high-speed bandwidth. So the Gigabit city thing is part of this overall thing, but my holistic view of smart cities is way bigger than how much bandwidth you have or how many sensors you have. It's about how you innovate as a government. So how do you innovate around procurement? How do you innovate around citizen participation? How do you innovate around technology and efficiency and mobility and all these things? So the Smart Cities Wheel is a mechanism for graphically displaying this more holistic model of what a smart cities is. So this won't come as a surprise to any of you, but thinking about what cities are doing around this space that relate to what you're all doing, open data is a huge topic in smart cities, very big topic. Cities like Helsinki have over 1,000 databases open for the public. Internet of Things, sensorization of cities. There's a new city being developed in Portugal. It's outside of Oporto. And they're going to have about 1 million sensors installed, and it equates to about 400 sensors per capita, to give you a rough estimate. So you can think about the power of gigabit infrastructure and supporting all the things that might come after such infrastructure implementation. Somebody mentioned this earlier, but innovation districts are a big thing in the smart cities arena. And the Brookings Institute recently came out with a report a few months ago about that. Barcelona was one of the first cities to implement an innovation district. What's different about an innovation district in Silicon Valley? Silicon Valley and the suburban tech park thing is suburban, and the innovation district is urban. It is embedded into the urban core of a city. It's frequently, although not 100%, but almost always, done as a regeneration project as well. So it's frequently done in a poor area of the city. that has been underserved by infrastructure and investment over the past decades, and they use tax breaks and other incentives to encourage tech companies and startups and individuals to move into that space. In the case of Barcelona, they implemented high-speed bandwidth, faster bandwidth to that part of the city than any other part of the city was receiving as a way to entice tech companies to come. Of course, because it's a regeneration project, that also means lower retail and residential and commercial rental space. So this innovation district thing is hot. It's Barcelona was one of the first, but it was replicated by the mayor of Boston, also in Buenos Aires and Medellin. It's sort of a new thing that's happening around the world. It's very interesting. This is one of my favorite pet projects. I've interacted with the people behind it several times now. It's in Amsterdam. Super cool. They are partnering with 4 local universities in Amsterdam, with MIT, with the city of Boston, the city of Amsterdam, and several multinational corporations to treat the city as an urban laboratory. But we used to talk about urban labs with sensors only. This is way beyond sensors. They've identified 4 key challenges for Amsterdam that they want to co-create solutions for. And this is urban food systems, energy, water, and buildings. And so this collaboration is going to work through master's programs and incubation programs and everything else to come up with new solutions that they will then test in the city itself. And the ones that emerge will then be exported. And the idea is to sort of not just treat Amsterdam as a living lab, but also actually cement Amsterdam's status as a global innovator at the city level. It's a paper I published just a few months ago in a magazine called Technovation, where we looked at 3 different types of demand-side tools that cities are using or capable of using to stimulate sustainable technology innovation in their city, depending on where the technology is on the S-curve. So procurement for innovation is a hot topic now. The city of Barcelona, again, is a leader in this one. They experimented with this thing called BCN Open Challenge. 6 challenges, which are 6 problems they identified, a range of budget for fixing those problems, and no predetermination of specifications or a predetermination of what the solution they wanted. We're just going to define what our problem is, and we're going to let the world think about, again, this open innovation idea. We as a city might not be the smartest people to come up with the world's best solution to this problem. Why don't we identify the problem very clearly and let the world find the world's best solution? So they bring it out, they publish the challenges in 3 languages, and they let the world respond with interesting suggestions. The other ones are voluntary standards and incentives and regulation. These are all demand-side tools cities are experimenting with as a way to stimulate local innovation entrepreneurship. There's the open challenge from Barcelona I mentioned. It's another one I'm really following quite closely, doing a lot of research in this area, the whole sharing city space. I have a paper I'm working on. We looked at 18 different sharing activities that are occurring in cities right now that have a direct impact on sustainability in the cities. Seoul is trying to become the world's global capital city of the sharing economy. Why? They looked at their density, this high rate of smartphone penetration, and the environmental impacts of their current consumer society in Seoul, and said we could really position ourselves as a global leader. What are they doing? Everything from opening data, opening public buildings in nighttime hours. So they did an inventory of all their buildings and looked at the usage patterns and found that, surprise, surprise, 98% of all their public buildings were totally not used after 7 at night and pretty much not used ever on Saturday and Sunday. So why not let the community use these buildings for meetings and other things rather than let them go sort of wasted during that time. They've got funds to help startups incubate and accelerate startups in the sharing economy space. Sharing economy is very big, it's huge, and it's getting The proliferation of technology is a big supporter of the growth of the sharing economy, something I highly recommend you track if you're not. The maker movement and the rise of urbanpreneurs and civic entrepreneurs. So all this ties together. Some of you have heard about the maker movement, maker space. It's big, it's growing. I already showed you a maker example with the coolest cooler guy. That's a maker. He doesn't have a startup company. He doesn't have investors. He doesn't have employees. He's a maker. He prototypes in his basement or his apartment, and he pitches his idea to the world. So what infrastructure? So if, a colleague of mine calls this the invisible infrastructure for innovation and entrepreneurship ecosystems in cities. Things like co-working spaces. Our spaces, as all of you know, this is an example in Kansas City, but co-working is huge around the world. It allows these makers, these independent entrepreneurs, and others to gain access to resources without having to spend all this money on office space and the rest, but also collaborate with other people. Fab labs are super interesting. There's about 300 of them around the world. There's actually 1 or 2 in the Kansas City area. And fab labs are ways for people to, it's kind of like co-working on steroids or something, because it's also shared space, but it also comes with all this really cool toys for tinkerers, for makers to play with, like 3D printers and laser cutters, and allows the average person on the street or the average citizen access to things that before only large companies could afford. And this is part of my whole story about why we're coming back to this urbanpreneur as a different kind of animal. It might not be somebody who hires 100 people. It might be somebody who replaces, who is an independent entrepreneur instead of being an employee in a company. But if you look at the trends over the last decades, where does employment come from? It doesn't come from big companies. It's from small companies. But I think the next stage is actually not even so much growing employment levels through companies that grow and hire more and more people, but actually these people that are self-inspired, that are able to weave into the knitting of the city and get resources from and share information and share resources from others and create cool new ideas and export them to the world or do whatever, but from their house or from a co-working space or from a fab lab. Meetups are big. You can sort of measure. In fact, one of my colleagues and I want to create an index for measuring this urbanpreneur thing and look at, for example, the number of meetups that happen in a city and the number of people that go to them. This is like a proxy for how dynamic your ecosystem is in your community and how networked it is. This was brought up by somebody else, the New Urban Mechanics Boston Code for America, we're going to hear from later tonight. Civic accelerators are popping up. This is another trend that I find really interesting. It's kind of parallel with this urbanpreneur thing, but it's a certain type of entrepreneur that's totally focused on solving urban problems through entrepreneurial solutions. And this is not something we've talked about or researched much in the business world yet, but it's sort of emerging in a big way. This is a paper I'm finishing with another colleague. We studied 15 or so civic entrepreneurs. These are people that, again, are identifying a problem with quality of life in their city and trying to find an entrepreneurial solution to that problem. And so what we found is that unlike other types of entrepreneurs, they're often solving either public or private or merit good gap problems. So think of transportation as a good example. There's a public good, for example, sidewalks and bike paths are full public goods, free to everybody, no one can be excluded. Merit goods are things like public transit where everyone can use them, but there's usually some fee associated with it. And then a full private good is, of course, a transaction between a company and a consumer. And so what we find is that civic entrepreneurs, say in the transit area, are finding that there's a gap in the marketplace in the sense that none of these are solving all of the problems. Might be the first mile, last mile problem, some of you are probably familiar with. Think about all the car sharing, bike sharing, ride sharing innovations that are occurring. These are basically trying to solve gaps in the existing offering for citizens. and they're embedded in territory, which is unique, that they're part of the place. You guys all hear about and talk about placemaking. Civic entrepreneurs are part of the place. They're embedded in place. They feel the pain as a citizen, and they want to solve it. And we find they are more commonly going for collaborative solutions rather than other types of entrepreneurs that aren't necessarily thinking of collaboration, but a civic entrepreneur wants to collaborate often with the local government and local communities to co-create and co-solve a problem that they've experienced in their community. A good example, I've talked about crowdfunding already. I was talking about more in the traditional sense. We already heard from Jace Wilson earlier today. He was actually one of the people we interviewed for our study. This is his company, Neighborly, civic crowdfunding. So there's a massive crowdfunding space, but there's this emergence of civic crowdfunding, which is basically a tool to help fund civic entrepreneurs innovate and create projects to improve quality of life in their city. That's it. Thank you.
So, I mentioned before, this isn't a fiber talk, but the work that he's describing is the work that we do here. And the KC Digital Drive in particular is pretty involved in it. And it's a hard thing to translate. I think, Bradley, you would probably say the same thing. Right? That probably resonates with you and what Burlington Ignite has done. And so here in Kansas City, I don't know that people would see us as doing all of this work. There's sort of a gap between what happens when you start thinking about what you do with fiber and all the stuff that you just ran down. So I thought that was a great overview, and would love to take some questions from people here. There's the mics are up, so Eric, if you want to come up, please feel free to ask any questions you might have about how to draw that out, because I think that's important.
Report card for communities in terms of GDP. Michael Curry is working on a report card for GDP in terms of small business. Have you thought about a report card for communities in terms of these elements, or to look at, you talked about connectivity in terms of meetups. It would be really interesting, how can we measure this? Mm-hmm. How can we propel our communities forward in this space? Or tell me what you see. What's propelling these communities forward?
Yeah. I'm certainly quite into measurement. My new version of Ranking Smart Cities has 62 indicators in them. As I mentioned, the penetration of broadband is one of or two of the indicators I use. But it's important to mention that what I just presented is sort of my emerging research that doesn't involve, I haven't collected data yet on this issue that I'm talking about, which actually is very parallel with Richard Florida's work. But for example, his recent stuff looking at the migration of venture capital from suburban to urban, I'm actually looking at what I think is maybe the next stage. It's not just about emerging tech companies moving into city centers because it's more dynamic, it's where the young people want to live, but also that there's a new breed of entrepreneur I call the urbanpreneur, which isn't necessarily creating jobs or hiring a lot of people, but doing this other thing I talked about. That thing that I'm referring to, the urbanpreneur, I have a colleague of mine and I are looking at creating a composite index to measure things like per capita meetups, per capita things on co-working space, other ways of trying to measure this sort of ambiguous thing that's we're observing, but there's not really tangible evidence to measure it yet. But the indicators I use for smart cities are publicly available. I worked with the Smart Cities Council in the US this year to publish the indicators, so they're freely available. And the Smart Cities wheel and the old indicators I used to use are publicly available on my website already, which is boydcohen.com.
So that's where we find the indicators, the 62 indicators on your website.
The 28 that I used last year on my website, the 62 that I'm using this year are with, there's a link to them on the Smart Cities Council website, and also they're available in Fast Company, a recent article in Fast Company online.
I think everything you said is spot on. Totally, I think this is a great keynote. Thank you. How do we get institutions, big institutions in our communities, to get up to speed with what you've been talking about? How do we convince them of these things and explain to them that this is the way to think about it?
Good question. I've been mostly working with cities so far as opposed to institutions on helping them rethink what they're doing to promote innovation and entrepreneurship in their community. I haven't worked a lot with major institutions that are local. I think the city has to get on board first. And again, my sense is, and I even felt like I heard the bias in the morning talks, that there's still a bias within the local economic development world about how do we either create incentives to attract the 1,000+ employees to our city, or what do we do to create the Silicon Valley in our city? And so I think the cities and the city leaders need to start understanding that this new urbanpreneur thing that's emerging is big. The sharing economy is big. This maker movement is big. And the cities that figured that out early, I think, are going to be well positioned because they're the ones that are going to attract all this millennials. Millennials aren't just attracted to trying to get a job in a big company anymore. They're attracted by a lot of these things we're talking about. So I think the city has to get on board first. And then the question is, how do you get the other institutions on board? And it obviously depends on which institutions, because that's sort of a broad statement, whether you're talking about the large corporations that are in place or other public entities.
Like universities, colleges, other hospitals, big institutions, anchor institutions within the community.
Some universities are getting this now. I mean, this whole, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the triple helix and the quadruple helix concept where the university is a big player in the innovation ecosystem in a city. A lot of cities are getting that, and the example I gave of Amsterdam is a good one in terms of how aggressive they're being and sort of trying to create this test beds in the city to co-innovate stuff. Universities have a tendency to be very slow to adapt to new trends, and my colleagues, I would say, in the business faculty around the world are amongst the slowest I think there are in the planet. A lot of other researchers in other disciplines are amongst the first to identify, for example, in medicine, to find cures or new connections with genes or whatever. In the case of the business world, the faculty tend to be behind the trends. And so they start documenting after it's already big. For example, I was doing some research in the sharing economy. I am still floored. There virtually are 0 publications in refereed journals anywhere in a mainstream business journal about the sharing economy yet, even though it's so big. So universities are slow, but some of them are getting it. And it's a question of having some individuals in these institutions that embrace this stuff too and become a champion to try to at least pilot something. Like I found in universities, they're often not very excited about doing a full-scale center in something like the sharing economy. But if a researcher starts researching the sharing economy locally, and then say a corporation funds some of the research because they're interested in a part of this or the open innovation or whatever that might be, and that goes well, they're following the money, and then they start saying, wait, maybe there's something here, and then you can build it. So it's maybe not take the big leap. Not all the institutions are ready to take a big leap. Sometimes they have to do baby steps.
My name is Denise Lynn, and I work with the Ash Center for Innovation at Harvard Kennedy School. And one thing I think that's interesting is the fact that the fiber community and also the innovation community sometimes has a similar issue with city governance as far as finding or pinpointing someone formally in the city government who owns the issue. Cities recently have, Boston, for instance, they just hired a new chief digital officer. Chief innovation officers vary in what they're responsible for across cities. Do you think one city in particular is institutionalizing either fiber or innovation? And how do you think that will pan out in the years to come?
Yeah, good question. All that's pretty emerging, as we all know. The whole CIO, CTO, innovation officer at the municipal level is pretty new. And I don't know that any city's gotten it quite right yet. I've worked with a lot of cities, both more in Europe and in Latin America in this area. And for example, Buenos Aires has a whole ministry in the city called modernization. They have like 100 employees, and the minister is in charge of modernizing the city and cross-cutting innovation, they have a lot of problems, as you can imagine, because Buenos Aires is a big city, and they have like 15 ministries. And the modernization ministry does not have really any authority over anything, over transportation, over education, over anything they want to innovate on. So they have to find ways to collaborate, and there's a lot of infighting because the other ministries don't really want to play nice with them because they feel like the modernization ministry is trying to force them to do things differently than they want to do them. In Santiago, where I live now, we have a grand mayor who, and again, I think this political will is a huge factor. The cities that really are driven by mayors that get this and want this to happen are often willing to invest resources and hire somebody who will be the right-hand person for this. And in the case of Santiago, we do have now a right-hand person who's like the point person for anything around innovation. Barcelona has an office of, they're kind of messy though. They have a smart cities division, which has like 5 people. They do amazing stuff. But then they have a chief innovation officer and they have several others, and they're all kind of parallel. So no one has ultimate responsibility. So I guess my long answer is I don't have a lot of exposure to a city that I think is like the prime example of how to manage it. I just had a meeting with a chief innovation officer in Barcelona like a month ago, and he's still trying to figure out how they coordinate all these innovation activities that are happening in all these different government offices. But I think to get to your ultimate question, which is what's the next step in this, I think you will have to have a single authority that has some resources and ability to coordinate with other elements within and outside of the city.
Boyd, actually, as I wear the co-chief innovation officer hat in Nashville, just really appreciate your presentation. I'm curious what your, all of your field research has shown in terms of the role of the city. Oftentimes, these urbanpreneurs or these innovators, they are very much innovate first and then maybe engage with the city later. They're very disruptive in the positive sense of the word in that sense, where you can actually just go and scale out something. Airbnb and Uber and all the ride sharing are perfect examples right now of companies that are based on a technology platform that then are now faced with scores of cities that are responding with different ordinances. And so I'm curious, as you are working with the innovators coming from that disruptive side, how that can be bridged, because it seems like the cities will never be the ones driving that innovation, but then afterwards there might be a convening role, but after the fact sometimes feels too late already.
Yeah.
So I'm curious what your thoughts are.
I totally agree. I almost included a slide on that. I just published another paper because we studied about 20 business models in the sharing and shared mobility space. So we looked at ride sharing, car sharing, and bike sharing business models really around the world. And we were trying to understand what the proper relationship was between the entrepreneur and the city in these areas. And this is not going to come as a surprise to you because you're tapping into the same issue we identified. But we basically discovered that the business models that are going to have the most longevity, in our opinion, based on our review, are the ones that actually have embedded relationships with the cities, and the sooner the better. Now, this depends a lot on whether or not they would be within what we would call the civic entrepreneur space. So are they trying to solve... This is the kind of thing I think is so fascinating about the civic entrepreneur space, which is they're trying to solve a problem that probably historically everyone would presume is the responsibility of city government. So if transportation is a problem, it's not an entrepreneur's problem, it's a city's problem. But these new civic entrepreneurs are saying, hey, there's a problem here and the city can't be expected to solve all our problems, we're going to solve them. The platform version, we found 3 types of civic entrepreneurs. There's a neighborhood scale, a city scale, and a platform scale. The platform scale are the ones that are least likely to talk with cities before they do it, because they are the most scalable. They can go to multiple cities in a few months' time and be present everywhere. And so they don't have the time or the patience or the insight to interact with any one city, and they're thinking more like tech entrepreneurs have. previously around scalable business models. The neighborhood-based and the city-based civic entrepreneurs are immediately looking to collaborate with the local government, with local neighborhood associations. So it's a platform play is a tricky one because it's hard for a platform tech play to try to enter into relationships with hundreds and eventually thousands of cities in a short period of time. But in order for them to be successful long-term, they're going to have to find ways to do that. And I think some of them are, as you say, they're retroactively trying to figure this out because they're running into so many hurdles, Airbnb and the rest of them.
The last piece I'll just throw in is in terms of the policies that you're seeing around the urbanpreneurs. Nashville is benefiting from a lot of these kind of co-working and then also urban manufacturing type. But there is an increased demand for parking. The greater square foot, the greater number of employees per square foot that occurs with co-working and also woodworking, metalwork, it changes the demands that are needed from an infrastructure perspective within cities. So it's almost like a request for a research paper, since you're giving some money. Could you do also a research project on that policy response to that increasing, that densification around employees, because it has immense impacts from public transportation all the way to, sidewalks and walkability and biking and all of that. So just great to see your research. So.
Thank you. One of the points on that I didn't talk about, but a lot of people are hoping that part of this phenomena I was presenting around co-working and 3D printing facilities and fab labs and all this stuff is that there's a possibility that in the future some of the stuff could be located in suburban or satellite city areas and actually help stem the flow of urban migration into the cities, which would be a counter to the problem you're identifying in that everybody, because right now a lot of these facilities are in urban core areas, but in the future I think you'll see them more in remoter areas that will allow people to telecommute instead of go into their corporate offices, will allow people to co-create stuff in satellite areas. But in the short term, I think you're right, it certainly is gonna elevate the density of office activity in the areas where these things are. In some cases, it's not a bad thing because in a lot of cities, they're doing this in urban regeneration plans where there isn't a lot of density or people working there. But in the places where it is, certainly a problem, although you find that a lot of people that are most attracted to this stuff are not the car driving public. In fact, many of you have seen this, but the average millennial prefers to have a great data plan on an iPhone than actually own a car, which is why they're living closer to residential areas. It's why they're also participating in all these sort of co-working spaces. So it's a different generation, and so the vehicle traffic issue may not be as big for that audience, but they certainly create more density.